Going into 2024, the Denver Broncos are embracing a youth movement. We'll tell you why this young nucleus on this roster will help them in 2024 and beyond on today's episode, Locked On Broncos.
You are Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's happening, Broncos Country? Welcome into another episode of Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm Cody Roark, Broncos reporter for Mile High Sports, joined alongside, as always, by Sayre Bedinger, site expert, predominantlyorange.com. We have you covered every single day on all things pertaining to the Denver Broncos as training camp begins this week. We're really going to ask the question here today: will the youth of this team help the Broncos or hurt them in 2024? We'll look at every position. We'll look at all the storylines. We'll look at the age bracket on this team, and you'll get an in-depth, deep dive into that here on today's episode of the show, which is also brought to you by our friends over there at FanDuel. Make every moment more. And as the playoffs wind down, sports stop sporting the way that we want them to. This summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. So visit FanDuel.com to get started. Look, Sayre, training camp coming up quickly. A lot of youth on this team. And when we're putting the show together, really looking at, okay, hey, what's the youngest age on this team? What's the oldest age on this team? And what is the age bracket for a majority of this roster? You know, to be honest with you, I came away quite surprised at how young this team is and how young this team has simply gotten in the offseason. Obviously, the two veteran names that we're talking about that got released, Russell Wilson being one of them at the quarterback position, veteran guy there, been in the league a long time. Broncos going to face him this season. Justin Simmons, longtime vet as well for the Broncos, released. And now Denver has made a lot of changes, specifically at quarterback and also at safety, where they have gotten younger in a sense in terms of trying to figure out how they're going to compete in 2024. So many different angles here that we learned about with this team, which you look at it, Sayre, on paper, you look at the age bracket, it is a true youth movement here for Sean Payton and this Broncos team.
A clear priority this offseason to get younger across the board, and not just getting younger for the sake of getting younger. I think kind of hitting reset at certain places on this team where Sean Payton maybe evaluated in his first year there and was like, you know what, we kind of need to reset the clock here. And if we're going to have a healthy organization going forward, these certain things need to happen. So you look at the Denver Broncos roster, only 12 guys age 29 or older, only 8 players, I mean, over the age of 30, right? So it's kind of one of those things that's like, it's not a veteran-laden team. There are some key veterans in place, but there's not a lot of guys that, as you and I were kind of talking, like who's getting maybe close to being done in the NFL, there's not a lot of those guys. There just aren't. And so when you have a young team like this, a young nucleus, you're really banking on your coaching to get the most out of these guys, as opposed to having the veterans on the field to kind of carry things. Remember, that's certainly what it was like in the Super Bowl 50 era, when the Broncos had so many veterans that were just, they were so good. They made everybody around them that much better. You didn't necessarily, I mean, you need good coaching and things like that. But I mean, Peyton Manning and Adam Gase, that's a great example of that. Who's carrying that offense? So with the Denver Broncos now, it's more about the coaches. The coaches are the veterans. The players are going to be asked to grow very quickly. And these young guys, Cody, there's going to be a lot of pressure on their shoulders to win right away, because this franchise has endured enough losing. Now you put the pressure on this young roster to go out there and perform. It's going to be fascinating to see how they all respond.
Well, and you mentioned the players who are 30 or more. You mentioned the 8 players: Riley Dixon, Will Lutz, Tim Patrick, obviously 30 years old, Alex Singleton, 30 years old, Angelo Blackson is 31, Philip Dorsett, 31, Garrett Bowles and Michael Burton are the 2 oldest players on the team. They're both 32 years of age. And you really, okay, there's 8 players in that age bracket right there. And when you look at the rest of the roster, I think when you categorize it from 29 years of age to 25, right, I think that's the average median in terms of where you're at. And you know, I'd say most NFL teams, 48 players on this current roster, right? The 91-man roster that the Broncos currently have, 48 players who are in the age range of 29 years to 25 years. And these are obviously some guys that you can build with. And keeping that in mind as well, you look at the age bracket between 24 years of age and 20, there are 31 players. So a wide portion of this roster, as it is going into training camp, is relatively young, which, I mean, you can weigh the pros and cons of that. That could be a good thing. It can also be a bad thing, right? But I think that's where you make a great point. You have to have good coaches. You have to have veteran coaches who know what they're doing. I trust Sean Payton. I trust Pete Carmichael. I trust Joe Lombardi. I trust guys who've been coaching in this league for a long time. Now, the question is how can they bridge the gap between young players who are coming into the league from the college ranks to now the NFL, where it's a different animal? How do you accelerate their development and their learning to where they can be impact players on Sundays? Because it's not just easy coming in from college football on Saturdays to coming into the NFL on Sundays. It's a more disciplined regimen that these guys are all facing. So how do you build the nucleuses of this roster identity-wise, knowing that you are young? And I think this is a great question that we can kind of segue here into this is, okay, because Denver has such a young roster, is the expectation changing for this team? Now, obviously, Broncos country always has the expectation they need to win. If the Broncos can find a way to win while being young and having guys that are going to be around for quite some time, that I think can set the trajectory for where this team is headed and a different course that'll give, I'd say, more optimism to the fan base going forward.
100%. And I think for every fan, it's going to be different, but the general consensus right now seems to be that maybe a lot of people, maybe too many people, maybe most people are sleeping on the Broncos at this point, and that the expectation is for them to kind of surpass expectations, right? And I think that's what a young team can do. We saw, I know Houston is kind of the prime, it's the low-hanging fruit of the example right now, because that's a team that came out last year. And I remember looking at some way too early mock drafts, Cody, for 2024 when it was going into the 2023 season, and Houston, who had their first round pick going to Arizona, they were supposed to be sending the first or second overall pick to Arizona because not everybody really thought much of Houston, and they didn't think they were going to be good at all last season. They figured Jacksonville is going to win the AFC South. If not Jacksonville, then certainly not the Texans. I mean, they were terrible according to most people last year. So to me, that's where you have a chance to come out and kind of open the eyes of everybody as a young team. You really have an opportunity to surpass all expectations, to pretty much overachieve in any sense if you have success at all. That's kind of where I think a young team has the advantage, is that everybody's counting this team out. They're saying you're the worst roster in the league. They're saying you got, overrated head coach and you got all this stuff. That's where I think a young team can really benefit you, because you don't have all these players that are grizzled NFL veterans who have this, they've gotten used to losing, quite frankly. And I think that's something that Garrett Bowles can teach this locker room about, is like, hey, here in Denver, it's unfortunate we've kind of gotten used to losing. None of us know what it's like to win here in Denver. That's like the history books. So that's where a young team can come in and say, you know what, we've got this new chip on our shoulder. Everybody's saying we're going to be terrible, and we're going to come in and we're going to write our own narrative and create our own culture.
I think that's important. And look, I'd say the identity of that locker room is very on par with that. Like, they're hungry, and look, they've seen, like we mentioned it in yesterday's episode of the show, a lot of players are keeping bookmarks on what people are saying about this team. And look, granted, you have to go out there and perform, but they want to keep tabs when the turnaround does happen. There is a belief that a turnaround will happen. I know Broncos country has been waiting forever for this to come to fruition. Will we see it here? I think it's very possible here. We can see this with the Broncos. But in terms of looking at where this team is at in terms of positions where youth may benefit the Broncos this upcoming season, could Bo Nix, as a rookie quarterback, be in a position to where the Broncos can thrive with a young nucleus of players? We'll dive deep into that here on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. Broncos country, today's episode of the show is brought to you by our friends over there at LinkedIn Jobs. And when you're hiring for your small business, you want to find quality professionals that are right for the role. That's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs has the tools that'll help you find the right professionals for your team faster, and best of all, for free. LinkedIn isn't just a job board. LinkedIn helps you hire professionals that you can't find anywhere else, even those who aren't actively looking for a new job, but they might be open to the perfect opportunity and role if it opens up. In a given month, over 70% of LinkedIn users don't visit other leading job sites. So if you're not looking on LinkedIn, you're looking in the wrong place. Over 86% of small businesses on LinkedIn, they get a qualified candidate within 24 hours of a job posting. Hire professionals like a professional on LinkedIn. LinkedIn knows that small businesses are wearing so many hats and might not have the time or the resources to hire. LinkedIn is constantly finding ways to make the process easier. They even just launched a brand new feature that helps you write out job descriptions, making the process even easier and quicker. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedon NFL. That's linkedin.com/lockedon NFL to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply.
Having a young core of players for this Denver Broncos team is a lot more than just ignorance is bliss. These guys can come in and absolutely turn this franchise around in 2024. Cody and I are going to talk today about why having a young roster could really help the Denver Broncos here in the 2024 season, but want to say thank you to every single one of you that makes Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day, wherever you listen to your podcast, or if you subscribe over on YouTube. And if you haven't done that yet, by the way, you should go ahead and do that. Go subscribe to Locked On Broncos on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. And hey, stick around on YouTube. Check out Locked On Sports Today, a free 24/7 streaming channel where you can get experts for all the teams that you love, covering the analysis every single day, coverage of all the stuff that you want to know about your favorite teams, 24/7 streaming on YouTube or on the free Amazon Fire TV channels app right here on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Cody, I said it, ignorance can be bliss for a young roster. And certainly when you have a bunch of guys that are coming in that, we're not clinging to the Super Bowl 50 stuff anymore. That era is gone. And none of those players are even really around anymore, right? I don't think any remaining Super Bowl 50 guys are in the Denver Broncos organization. So to me, you have a young roster that it's more so than just the devil you know versus the devil you don't. These young guys can actually help this team turn things around quickly, not just because they're fresh legs, but because they don't have any concept of what it's like to be on a losing team here in the NFL.
Yeah, and look, I think a really good motivation for so many of these guys, the young guys in the locker room, they get to walk around, they get to see the Lombardi trophies at the team facility. And look, they get to see from time to time veterans and alumni coming back and talking to them at practice, or, a Sean Payton. I think he does a really good job. Sean Payton, in my opinion, is a very good historian in a sense, in the way that he teaches, because he'll find a way to bridge something like, look at what this team had here. Like, we have to develop this type of component within our own team DNA if we want to achieve the goals that we have this upcoming season. And I know that's one thing that the players really like about Sean Payton, is he brings some of those things up. With that said, though, like, you have to gain valuable experience by playing, right? And I think so much of what we've talked about, like specifically the quarterback competition, really comes under focus this week as training camp really kicks off. Fans get to attend practice. We've seen so much commentary about, well, Jarrett Stidham, he's older. He's the more experienced guy in terms of, the rooms he's been in, despite not having as much starting experience. The Broncos should just play it safe and start him and let Bo learn. What is that going to do in the window that the Broncos have with the young roster that they currently have right now? Look, if Jarrett Stidham wins the job, then he deserves it, obviously. But for Bo Nix, if Bo comes out, plays well in training camp, plays well in the preseason, wins the starting job outright, that has to be exciting, because it's like, all right, now you have a young guy that you're like, okay, we've seen things that he can do. We're confident in him. And even if year one of him as the starting quarterback doesn't go great in terms of the team winning as many games as you want them to, but he's taking the necessary strides, you can build on that. Look, and I hate to make this comparison, but it's like, you look at the Tennessee Titans, Sayre, like this offseason, they've been plagued with change. No Derrick Henry. You get Callahan in as the head coach. And all of a sudden, like that fan base there, they're a little bit excited about what maybe they have in Will Levis, who, look, we don't know much about. We know he's got a big arm, and, that's great. But that team has definitely got a different identity than what we have grown accustomed to seeing in Tennessee. The Broncos could be in a similar position, but I think Denver might be better off here with the nucleus of players that they do have. I think Bo is a more polished quarterback than a guy like Levis at this point. There's not as much uncertainty, I think, with Bo Nix as there might be in some other franchises, some other organizations who have chosen to go down the path of a youth movement. In my opinion, youth at the quarterback position, this could be a benefit here for the Broncos this upcoming season. And I also kind of want to open it up to you as well here. Like, are there any other positions on this team where you feel like youth right now, younger players, or a good bulk of your depth being younger, could benefit the team now and also maybe in the next 2 to 3 years?
Well, I think cornerback, as you talk about quarterback, I think cornerback is another one because last year it was really, with Fabian Moreau out there playing on the outside, you kind of understand that this is only going to last for a short period of time. Even when you sign guys like Kyle Fuller and Ronald Darby, you kind of get the impression like this is just a short window. This isn't a potential long-term solution. And with drafting guys and developing guys, you do have the potential of a long-term solution. So, hey, Riley Moss, you're up, you're next, right? He provides you with that option to say, okay, not just for the next 3 years, but potentially another 3 or 4 or more years on top of that. And not to put the cart before the horse or anything, but obviously you all understand listening, like that's the benefit of drafting and successfully drafting somebody at a position is that you can have a long-term option there. So I think that's what the Broncos have with the youth at corner is you have long-term options and not just Riley Moss either, but Jaquan McMillan, who's got 2 years left on the deal that he initially signed as a rookie. And certainly you view him as a potential long-term option. Damari Mathis still got 2 years on his rookie deal. And Chris Abrams-Drain just came in. So there's a lot of guys with youth at the cornerback position and not just youth, but talent and actual starting potential that could end up being viable long-term solutions opposite Pat Surtain or in the slot or both. So I think that's what really gives you the upside at corner now is in years past or in recent years, your secondary has felt like even as a whole, like with the safety and cornerback positions considered, it feels like, man, we're just kind of in a window right now. We're not going to have Kareem Jackson for very long. We're not going to have Kyle Fuller for more than a year or this, that, and the other. This year, it feels like there's at least the potential that you have long-term options across the board.
Yeah, I mean, at corner, at safety, like that's a comforting feeling here. I know there's obviously a lot of youth at both of those positions, and even at safety, like the depth behind the guys we anticipate to start. They're young, and you want to see, the guys like J.L. Skinner, Devin Key, Tanner McAllister, some other players that are going to be in the mix here during training camp. And I also think maybe we should look at edge rusher as well. You look at Baron Browning, you look at Jonathan Cooper, you even look at Nick Benito, and now Jonah Ellis. Like your top 4 pass rushers, they're young. Like, and they have talent. They have potential to have a really, really big impact this upcoming season and maybe even after this year. We know that 2 of those guys are at the ends of their rookie deals and they're looking to get contract extensions in Baron Browning and Jonathan Cooper. But I mean, I'm excited about this position. I'm excited about cornerback. Like youth at times, I think creates a lot of like concern or like, I'm a little scared of this. I don't have that feeling necessarily about this Broncos team in terms of their young players. Like I'm genuinely excited to see the path and the trajectory of their development and getting playing time. I think the storylines will write themselves, but I don't have that feeling this year the way that I've had that in maybe prior years of covering this Broncos team. And I think that's an exciting thing here. And maybe even running back as well. I mean, you talk about the longevity of this position in the NFL, the overall view of it. I mean, it's changing. It's becoming shorter and shorter almost every year as it progresses forward here. And the Broncos really kind of have a youth movement here at running back. Because look, the youngest player on this Broncos roster is there, Audric Estime. He's 20 years old. 20 years old. 10 years younger than me, by the way. And that right there is crazy to me. You have a young guy in Jaleel McLaughlin. You have, I mean, obviously you have a veteran guy who's older in Samaje Perine. Javonte's still a young player. Tyler Beatty is still a young player. Like, I think the youth can be a good thing here for this team. And I think that there's also some questions that maybe come about youth, right? And we'll dive obviously deep into that. Are there any positions on this team where youth might be a little bit of a concern or you have questions about it in terms of position productivity? We'll take a look at that here on today's episode of Locked On Broncos. Today's Locked On Broncos is brought to you by our friends over there at FanDuel Sportsbook. And get involved all summer long on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. I love sports. You love sports. Right now in the summertime, sports aren't happening as much as we want them to. You've got Major League Baseball going on right now. NFL training camp is starting up this week, and NFL preseason games are just weeks away. And FanDuel is letting you get involved on all the action, including futures bets on the NFL side of things, because they keep sports going. And this summer, FanDuel, they are hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus every single day. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. NFL Futures lets you get involved on the action of who you think will win the NFL MVP this year, who you think will win the Super Bowl, or you can get in on the action on preseason games inside the FanDuel Sportsbook app. So head over to FanDuel.com and start making the most out of your summer today. FanDuel is the official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. As we jump to the fourth quarter action on today's episode, Locked On Broncos, want to say thank you once again to everybody in Broncos country, all the everydayers out there who make us your first listen. Thank you so much for your second listen. After today's show, make sure you go check out the Locked On NFL podcast as training camp opens up across the entire National Football League. What are the biggest storylines going into it? There's been some extensions, players listed on the PUP list. You can get all that action on Locked On NFL, wherever you get your podcast, or available on YouTube. We've talked so much really about this episode being how can the youth benefit the Broncos? And I think our overall perception, and Broncos country, we always want to hear from you as well as we dive deeper into this. I feel like, Sayre, you and I both feel good about the youth and the youth movement that this team has. When looking at positions on this team, are there areas where maybe youth or lack thereof is a little bit of a concern here for the Broncos going into 2024? I feel like there's definitely some question marks, in my opinion, versus major concerns.
Yeah, I think anytime you have young players, it's kind of the double-edged sword, isn't it? Because you have the optimism, not necessarily knowing what's going to happen, but believing that the best, could be ahead. But also the reality that, we've seen what happened to Paxton Lynch. We saw how things worked out with Drew Lock. We saw that things all across the league, you see young quarterbacks not working out. So I think that's kind of where you got to start, is that going young at the quarterback position doesn't necessarily always equal success. Like when the Broncos drafted Paxton Lynch, Cody, I know that it wasn't that long ago, but 8 years ago when they drafted him, I was so certain that the Broncos were going to be able to add any quarterback to Gary Kubiak's offense and that Super Bowl 50 defense. I was buying, the Paxton Lynch jersey right away. I was like, you know what? This is going to be seamless. We got a first-round quarterback. This is going to be great. The coaching is there. The defense is there. The supporting cast is there. Like, there's no way he can't succeed in this environment. And so I think there's a little bit of, obviously, just that hope that can burn you a little bit when you bring in a young player. It's like that young player has to do his part, right? They have to do all the work and put in all. And that's why I think we're confident in Bo Nix, because he seems like the type of guy that he's been a pro for years. The guy's been married for, I don't know how long at this point, but he's a mature adult, and he just bought his $4 million house there in Castle Pines or whatever that is. So, it's exciting to have somebody that seems so focused and driven at the position, as opposed to what we've seen a little bit here in the past. And so to me, there's the double-edged sword though, with that youth at the quarterback position. It's like, you can't just say it's better because it's younger, but that's the two sides of it all, isn't it? That's where I've struggled in history with the Denver Broncos, of being excited about young guys. It's like, yes, you want to be optimistic, but at the same time, everything could crash and burn.
Yeah, it certainly can. And I think when you look at, there was a level of excitement when Jay Cutler was drafted and when he finally started to play. And then unfortunately, Josh McDaniels came in and ruined that trajectory. Who knows what the Broncos would have looked like if that never happened, but woulda, coulda, shoulda. Tim Tebow, obviously, drafted by the Broncos and was able to lead the Broncos to the only rookie quarterback in franchise history to lead them to a playoff win. What a wild circus that was. Paxton Lynch, his biggest issue was he just didn't prepare. I think he was more focused on playing Madden and being in the Madden playbook versus being in the actual playbook. And that came back to bite him in the tail. And, you saw early on, like, wow, Trevor Siemian, like nobody knew who Trevor Siemian was, but he's Super Bowl 50 winning quarterback, even though he didn't play. He comes in and wins the starting job. You're like, what is going on? Like with Paxton Lynch and this Broncos team, I think Broncos fans are concerned about that. But for everything that you just mentioned about Bo Nix, the level of maturity and just where he's at and how he prepares. And look, if anyone didn't get a chance to catch that documentary that, got published of Bo as he went through the NFL draft process, the workouts, you'll see exactly a much more confident version of himself there. You see, that's exactly who he is in terms of how he prepares. He lives, breathes, eats, sleeps football. And that right there is a great thing. He's got the cerebral traits. He's got the physical talent to be able to do it. So to me, that's why I'm not necessarily as concerned, even though youth can be a bit of a question mark here going forward. So Broncos country, always eager to know how you feel about that. Maybe looking at some other positions here as well where youth may hurt them a little bit. I think everyone's going to be looking at the safety position, right? Justin Simmons, obviously no longer on the team. You go and you give an extension to PJ Locke, which is well-deserved. PJ can play some ball. Brandon Jones, you sign him in free agency. He can play some ball. But with that, like, obviously they're young. Like, they've got to, establish some chemistry playing together at the NFL level, even though they all played at Texas, and then factor in Caden Stearns, another young guy there. My thing here at the safety position, maybe why it's a question for me, not necessarily a concern, is that I can already see the headlines being written. Let's say the Broncos week 1 against Seattle give up, a couple of big passing touchdowns. Everyone's going to say, oh, they shouldn't have got rid of Justin Simmons. Like, you got to let these young guys play and mesh a little bit, make some mistakes, because that's part of the process of playing in the league. You got to be able to do it. But that's where I think the perception of youth at that position is going to definitely come back to maybe, rear its head, maybe week 1, week 2, or at any point where the Broncos defense maybe gives up some big plays in the passing game.
Yeah, that's where you're going to get the comparisons on Twitter if stuff starts to happen negatively. Like, hey, why'd we cut Justin Simmons? Why'd we let him? Even though a lot of fans on Twitter are coming out and saying, why did we give Justin Simmons the extension? I mean, he doesn't make enough of an impact. It's just so funny how that works, right? You can never win no matter what. So but I agree with you, Cody, the safety position, also maybe the center position right now, where the Broncos have put a lot of faith in young guys there, especially late round draft picks. Like, it's very much I've made this comparison before, but very similar to the Matt Paradis in 2015 situation, where Matt Paradis was a 6th round pick in 2014, spent his entire rookie year on the practice squad. Then all of a sudden he's the starting center for Peyton Manning in Manning's, final season, the last dance. And you're wondering, like, what the heck are the Broncos doing? They couldn't sign anybody else to go out and help this team at center, but they're putting confidence in this young duo with Alex Forsyth and Luke Wattenberg. Obviously, Sam Mustipher is still on the roster, and we'll see what happens there. But it feels like it's Forsyth and Wattenberg really competing for that starting job. And the Broncos are putting faith in a young player that has done nothing at this point in the NFL, which is fine. I mean, that's a lot of this roster, as we're talking about today. The only issue that I think people will have with that is that those two guys were very late draft picks, and the center market, free agency wise, has been pretty team friendly the last couple of years. And so if you really wanted to help out your rookie quarterback, those centers better be good is kind of where I think people are going to be at this point, especially because Lloyd Cushenberry developed and, got a big money contract. I know you can't keep everybody, but that's one of those position groups as well, where there's a youth movement happening, and it's the devil you know versus the devil you don't. I think a lot of fans would prefer, let's just slap a couple free agency bandages on these positions that we don't know whether or not the youth is going to come through. But a coaching staff in the NFL doesn't necessarily think that way. They project, they have vision, as Sean Payton says, for these players consistently, which is why it can be so frustrating, I know, for me and for many others, when you're trying to discuss these, what could happen, right? And you're trying to say, well, what if this guy breaks out, and immediately the discussion turns to, well, this guy's proven nothing. And that's how NFL teams think, though. They go and look at these guys on their whiteboards and they project into the future. Like, what can this guy become? What are we seeing at practices? What are you seeing in him in terms of the scouting, the future scouting? I mean, all these sort of different things go into it. So it's not that NFL teams are sitting there with pie in the sky and they just are believing the best and expecting no bad to happen. But at the same time, they are projecting for these young players. And that's a huge factor in your roster equation.
No, it is. And I'm glad that you brought that up, because I also think too, you made the reference to maybe slapping a couple of free agency bandages on there, right? Guys who are older, have experience. And look, I'm not opposed to that. I think there can be some guys you can bring in and obviously get a boost. I think any team that's going to bring in Justin Simmons this offseason, I think is going to get a significant boost in terms of that position productivity. But I think also as well, the idea is when you do go that veteran free agency route, a majority of the times, right, your window for maximizing the time that you have with them and also with the young players that you're still trying to develop, I mean, it decreases a little bit. Like the expectations are different. Where I look at this Broncos roster now, and you and I went over it earlier in the show, how young they are right now with a young quarterback maximizes their window to grow and develop. And that seems to be the emphasis from George Payton, Sean Payton, Greg Penner mentioned that during this offseason as well, as their philosophy is to build in the NFL draft and develop players. And that right there is the foundation, the formula. And we have all these young guys. You can do that. Sure, you are going to need veteran guys. You might need somebody who's 29 to 30, maybe even a 31-year-old player from time to time, but your roster majority can't be those guys at that age range at that point. And so there's so much excitement here, I think, with this team. There's a mystery around the Denver Broncos this year. And look, I know a lot of people aren't high on them. I know a lot of the sports books have them at 5.5 wins. I feel like that's an easy over this upcoming season. But for me, I think that this team will exceed expectations. I think that I don't see how they can be worse than they were last year. Look, they were as bad as they were last year. They still found a way to win 8 games. To me, that was impressive, being that the 1-5 start that they had early on, the 70-point debacle. They clawed their way out of that. I think they have a younger team, a more energized team right now. Certainly some questions in some areas. We're not discounting that. But I have a hard time believing they'll be worse than they were last year. And look, I think that's a conversation that we'll have throughout the entire offseason here, building up to training camp beginning this week. Preseason in just a few weeks' time. Here's the Broncos will open up against the Indianapolis Colts. One thing that Sayre and myself will guarantee you, Broncos Country, if you're an everyday listener, you're going to get a show every single day breaking down what's going on with your team. So make Locked On Broncos the place to be for your first listen. Become an everydayer if you're not an everydayer as well. And for your second listen of the day after this episode, go check out Locked On NFL wherever you get your podcasts or available on YouTube. And for you everydayers, if you want to know what we're going to talk about on tomorrow's episode of the show, here's what we're going to dive deep into here for the Broncos. When you look at this team, you look at the construction, the roster makeup, how will they overcome the personnel losses that they had in the offseason? We'll dive deep into that and much more in tomorrow's episode of the show.